Have you ever wondered if there's a better definition of life that is perhaps newer or more effective at defining what life is? In my curiosity, I stumbled across an article by Jaime Gomez Marquez entitled "What is Life?" in the 27 June 2021 edition of Molecular Biology Reports. In the first part of this article, the author considers 4 characteristics of life. In this video, we explore those 4 characteristics or qualities and see if they provide any insight above and beyond the definitions explored in Encyclopedia Britannica previously. Quite surprisingly, we find fear. But fear of what? Let's dive in and see what we can find out. Don't forget to stop by CesariProject.com and check out resources on thinking differently about chronic disease. Here's Jaime Gomez Marquez's article. The author states his objective here, which is to offer an alternative vision to the definition of life, taking as a starting point the traits common to all living beings. I would say that that's a common starting point for all definitions of life. Life has the following characteristics: pre-programmed, interactive, adaptive, and evolutionary. I see a spectrum. Over here on the left, pre-programmed sounds the most mechanistic. And over here on the right is the most characteristic of living systems. In between, we see words that have a gradual connection between mechanistic and purely living. The word pre-programmed really sounds like there's a control element, that an operator goes in and it tells a system what to do. It creates a working memory of sorts that controls the future actions of a particular system. It works in a push button or signal response manner. Life does have those qualities, often called habits or reflexes, for example, but this has a very different flavor. The second word, interactive, has slightly different flavors whether we're talking about electronic systems, mechanized systems, or living ones. In living ones, interactive means that there's at least 2 people or 2 organisms or 2 living systems involved, and they're communicating in a 2-way flow of information. Today, we talk about virtual reality being interactive or a user's interface with a particular website. So there are still 2 elements, with the user being one and a computer system or electronic system being another. Because the word interactive has taken on some more technological meaning, I think this word more accurately represents communication and how systems communicate. The third word, adaptive, really just means a system that has the ability to change to its environment in the short term. In human terms, we call that making a decision or making a choice. While we aren't often comfortable applying the idea of a decision or a choice to non-human systems, particularly the very small, adaptive just means the ability to change. And finally, there's evolutionary, which is also the ability to change on a much grander scale. Whereas adaptive pertains more to an individual in the now, evolutionary applies more to populations in the long run. Taken together, interactive suggests communication, and adaptive and evolutionary indicate the ability to change. Communication and change are definitely living qualities. That makes pre-programmed really stand out as an unusual and misplaced word in this list of otherwise living qualities. It's almost like a word needed to be in here that explains these other capabilities. And this author chose pre-programmed. Really what this means is DNA. We sort of see it as the programming device, the blueprint of all of life's functions. And given that the author has a background in biochemistry and molecular biology, it is not surprising that this kind of word would come in. The other observation here that we see with the other definitions of life that list different characteristics is that what it really boils down to is looking at, say, a rock or something that we agree is not living, is an inanimate object. It is matter that is not living. And it's quite clear when we're talking about a rock that we're not talking about pre-programmed, interactive, adaptive, or evolutionary. But then you go over here and you look at a living organism, a cell, a rabbit, a person, whatever it may be, and we use words like pre-programmed, interactive, adaptive, and evolutionary. So really, when we define life today, we look at rocks and rabbits, and then we try to decide what are the differences between them. And whatever a rabbit can do that a rock cannot, we think that defines life. And whatever words we use to explain what the rabbit does that the rock cannot do, we think it somehow doesn't just answer what, but how and why. When we start lacing what, how, and why with a mechanistic understanding or a technological understanding of human-created devices, we really start limiting ourselves in understanding what life is, how life does what it does, and why life exists at all. As we go into the introduction, the author comments on the tremendous advances in understanding, which I agree with. Here he importantly comments that despite these enormous advances, biology still lacks a solid theoretical framework, which would be necessary to understand the vital phenomenon, he calls them, or living functions, and to understand questions such as what is life. I couldn't agree more that biology does lack theory. And his point of view is coming from molecular biology and DNA. My point of view comes from that of medicine. I do have genetics as a background, but in terms of application, I'm dealing much more with the living side of science, where this author is coming more from the molecular side, which today we don't see so much as living. He states, to answer these and other fundamental questions related to life, in addition to the universal laws of physics, biology needs its own principles to help us find answers to major theoretical challenges. I pause there. I'm very interested in this particular segment that says, in addition to the universal laws of physics. Why is that in there? What I see is fear. Because when we talk about life, because life has a subjective element that very quickly jumps off the reservation of objective science into, say, metaphysical or mind or the subjective elements, anyone who wants to be taken seriously today as a scientist has to really drop anchors and roots into a physical interpretation of life. So that this comment gets stuck in there, it comes across to me as a plea to be taken seriously, which I find kind of sad, but it's also setting the tone that this author is not going to take any great leaps, that he's going to turn to the principles of an objective biology to try to explain the largely subjective nature of living systems, and that is going to limit the possibilities even in this article. That he goes on to say that biology needs its own principles. The way this reads is, well, biology, as long as it fits within the principles of science, then we're still in the world of rationality and truth. The trouble is science can't explain life. Life is too weird for an objective interpretation. That means that to understand life, we need to be broadening our scope. And that doesn't mean that we have to be anti-scientific. Rather, it's in the spirit of scientific inquiry that we push the boundaries and say, well, why can't today's paradigm explain life? Life doesn't defy the rules of a physical universe, but those rules don't explain life either. And in so many cases, perhaps because of a fear of not being taken seriously, smart, creative, and able minds are not willing to take the leap to push science in a new direction. I like that he himself has proposed a series of principles named the Commandments of Life, and goes on to say that these commandments emanate from an evolutionary perspective far from any vitalist, pseudoscientific, or supernatural considerations. So again, there's that fear factor of not being taken seriously. But it's immediately going to limit the possibilities in understanding the subjectivity of living. There are two major elements in the takeaway message here. The first is the pre-programmed notion, as I see it, is trying to tame or reduce the living nature of the following characteristics. But this begs the question of what pre-programmed is really trying to get at. I'm hopeful that further exploration of this article will answer that question. The second observation is the role of fear. Certainly we see the author's concern for his own credibility. The irony is the objective interpretation that science uses doesn't explain life. It lacks the vocabulary and concepts to do it. Why do we consistently turn to a way of thinking that can't explain life? It's kind of like Stockholm Syndrome in that we keep turning to our captor that limits our understanding of life, which has a subjective element. It's that subjective element that I think scares science and makes it incapable of ultimately defining what life is. We end with two possibilities in light of the fact that science can't explain life. The first is that life is not scientific. The second is that science is not scientific. That doesn't make science wrong or misguided. It simply means that science is too narrow to explain life and disease that happens within it. Please like, subscribe, and leave your comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in another video.